It has been a long time since I've spoken to you, Senator Bruce Tarr. Nice to see you again.
It's nice to see you on another beautiful day on Cape Ann, Heather.
Beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
Corey and I have been joking on Cape Ann today that all the shops around here will be running out of ribbons because you've been at so many ribbon cuttings. Every time I open a newspaper, you're at another ribbon cutting.
Well, you know, it is true, and it does take a lot of time, but it's also a very positive thing that folks are able to open new businesses or reopen businesses, because some of the ribbon cuttings have been for reopenings, but it's a very encouraging sign.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely positive. Actually, the last time I saw ribbon cutting, besides this whole cluster of them, was just before the pandemic, and it was the 1623 studios.
Oh yeah, yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes.
You were at that one too.
Yeah. So there's an interval there. You know, we've had a couple of years by and large with not that much activity, but now it's wonderful that people are picking back up where they left off, and it's just a very strong sign of confidence that small business owners are willing to make the investment, take the risk, and do what it takes to open a business and try to help us write new chapters in our economic story on the heels of hopefully on the heels of the bulk of the pandemic.
Well, so the 2023 budget is in conference committee right now. So we can put that aside for just a second, and we can talk about the work you've been doing recently. And last week, there was a bond bill passed in the Senate, right? And you had an amendment in that bill. So tell us about the bill, and I would love to hear about your amendment. Mostly, like, where did your amendment come from? Where do you get the idea for an amendment, and how do you write it?
Well, those are great questions. And let me just remind folks that the two budgets, the Senate version and the House version, are being reconciled by a 6-member conference committee. And what's significant about that is our state representative, Ann Margaret Ferranti, is one of the conferees that's doing that work. And I actually appoint a conferee as minority leader. So I appointed Senator Patrick O'Connor from Weymouth, and those 6 people are working very hard. And another significant piece to this is the new fiscal year starts on July 1st. So the goal is to try to have the budget on the governor's desk before that, ideally 10 days before that, to allow him to make vetoes and give us time to address them, but certainly at least by July 1st. And we don't always make that target. Oftentimes we pass interim budgets for very short periods of time, but I hope that it's going to be done by July 1st of this year. So with regard to the bond bill that we passed this week, Heather, which we just did on Thursday, it's, I think, worth taking a minute to explain the difference between a bond bill and an appropriations bill. So when we talk about the budget, we're actually talking about spending cash. We're talking about spending state tax revenue. We're talking about spending federal revenue that comes into the state for a variety of reasons. But when we talk about a bond bill, we're talking about an authorization for the state to borrow money. So we're not talking about spending cash we have, we're talking about borrowing money and then using it for a variety of proceeds. And bond bills are fairly common. They generally have a life of 5 to 10 years. So the things that we authorize in the bill can be done at least 5 years out, sometimes 10. And the other important element of bond bills is that the projects that we put into them generally need to have a useful life of more than 5 years, because we don't want to go through the expense and the cost of borrowing money for something that has a useful life of less than 5 years. Mm-hmm. And so the interesting thing about bond bills too is that they basically set the stage for the administration. So bond bills do not themselves result in spending. They set the stage for spending. We list all the things that we're going to allow the administration to spend on, but then the administration has to choose which things it's going to do. So it's a 2-part process. And to use some vernacular that you might be familiar with, when we write a bond bill, it's like we're writing a menu in a restaurant, and the governor chooses what he or she is going to eat.
That's a good way to describe it. Yeah.
So sometimes it causes a little bit of confusion, because people will see that there was an amendment to a bond bill that was very helpful, and they'll say, well, when do we get the money? But it's not a linear process in that way, because the administration has to produce a capital spending plan every year. And the reason for that is to ensure that we don't borrow too much. We don't get into trouble with our debt service costs. So there's a debt ceiling, and within that, there's a capital spending plan. You really have to fight to get something into that capital spending plan. So it's not a given if it's in the bond bill that it's ever going to happen at all. But that being said, obviously, we wanted to offer amendments to the bill. And just to give you a sense here, and I very rarely look down, but I'm going to do it right now because I've got my notes. And this particular bond bill was $5.07 billion. So this is
$5.07
billion. So this is a lot of money.
Yeah.
And 820 million of it was for things within the Executive Office of Health and Human Services. 750 million was for repairs at state institutions of higher learning. So our community colleges and our state universities. $675 million was for court facilities, for improvements to court facilities. And $530 million was for public safety improvements at various institutions. And importantly, $100 million was for grants to support municipalities for local construction needs. So I'll give you a little bit of insight into how the amendment process works. So generally, the Committee on Ways and Means releases its version of the bill, and we on the committee vote on that, and it goes forward. And usually when we do that, there's a timeline set for people to offer amendments. And so we then take the bill, we go through it, we look at it. In this particular case, you asked about where the ideas come from. Well, some of the ideas that I offered were policy ideas, but a lot of them were spending, were authorizations for dollars to be spent. And in this particular case, one of the things that we do periodically is ask our municipalities, do you have capital projects that would benefit from state funding that you would like us to consider? So we then go through the bill and we look at the categories that I just outlined and others that were in the bill. And we try to find areas where a local spending request matches one of those categories. And we sit down and we try to describe what it is that we're trying to fund. We try to attach a reasonable dollar amount to it. And then we file the amendment by the deadline. Now, in this case, there were approximately 175 amendments filed to this particular bond bill. And a lot of folks filed local priorities, just as I did, to try to get some things done. Now, to give you an example of one of those amendments, I know we've talked a little bit in the past about the idea of having combined wastewater treatment for the Cape Ann communities, instead of having everybody do their own wastewater treatment plant. And that's very costly. And we know that Gloucester needs a new treatment plant. We know that Rockport is having some issues with capacity. We know that Manchester is having issues with capacity. And we know that Essex depends on Gloucester. So to try to get at that, I offered an amendment for $400,000 to help the communities look at and build either the combined treatment, and mostly this would be planning money because it would cost a lot more than $400,000 to construct, but to look at how to do it and to plan how to do it either independently or collectively. And that amendment was adopted. So again, we need to remember that that's the first step of a two-part process. So now that if it makes it through reconciliation through a conference committee, which I'm confident it will, and it gets to the governor's desk and it gets signed, we then have to begin the process of advocating to the administration for why this particular amendment is important.
He needs to stick it on the menu.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we hope the governor has a hungry appetite for this particular item.
Yeah.
But there are also other amendments that we offer in bond bills that are of a policy nature. And one of the amendments that I offered looked at the fact that we are authorizing $5.07 or $01 billion in bonding, which ultimately could result in the cost of borrowing debt service. And I was also thinking that we're in a unique position because we have a lot of money in our state surplus that's exceeding what we need to run state government right now. And we still have some federal money. Why don't we look at whether or not we could use some of those resources to pay down existing debt or to spend money instead of borrowing so that we could eliminate the debt service altogether. And if we can do that, it will pay dividends for years to come when we would otherwise be paying debt service on the borrowing in some of these bond bills. So I offered an amendment to affect the Debt Service Affordability Committee, which is a committee that already exists. And that amendment would charge them with looking at our options to do what I just described. That amendment was adopted. So hopefully we'll be able to look at how we can position ourselves, given the unique place we're in, to be able to save money in addition to spending money. Now, another amendment that I offered, which did not prevail, would have given an overall mandate to everybody that gets any of this money, that uses it for constructing spaces, buildings, to require them to use the most energy efficient methods possible and to do everything possible to reduce carbon release. And unfortunately, the prevailing notion was that was a little bit too broad-based, and maybe it needed to be refined. So that one didn't pass. So we're 1 for 2 on policy amendments.
Well, bravo. But I really appreciate what an advocate you are for climate, for addressing climate change, and particularly carbon issues with carbon. You're really on top of that. So I'm sorry that didn't pass, but or get accepted, but we appreciate your work there.
Well, thanks, Heather. And in the legislative business, that you're not always going to get everything that you want. But I would point out that we did do a major climate bill that's now in conference committee. I'm serving on that conference committee. I think some of the things in that bill were not appropriate, others were. So we're going to try to work that out. And there is a sense of urgency here. And I think that it is imperative that we do a climate bill in this legislative session before it concludes. So I'm going to be working on that. And again, you always have another opportunity in the legislative process.
So that was passed, that went into conference committee early spring, right?
It did.
Right. So you're hoping that you can come out of committee and go to the governor's desk before the end of the session? Yes.
And part of the issue, and I got the inference that you're making about the time that it's taking, is that the bills are so radically different. The Senate bill, in my opinion, tried to address too many things all at once. The House bill is much more narrowly tailored, but as a result doesn't address many of the subjects that are in the Senate bill. So you can imagine what it's like for 6 people to try to sit down and reconcile that. It's a really difficult task. And I'm not the only person to say that. The chair of the Senate Committee on Telecommunications and Energy has also made that point as well. So we're going to do the best we can, but it is going to be a very difficult task.
Well, tell us what's happening this week. It's not quite as fast paced as working on the budget, but still got things happening.
So we do. So on this morning, actually, and to remind folks, we're talking on Friday. The Committee on Ways and Means released 3 bills, and 2 of them have to do with juvenile diversion in our criminal justice system and bail reform. And a third has to do with civil asset forfeiture. So we're still reading through those bills, and actually right now, we are in the process of thinking about amendments using the process I described. But these amendments won't rely on as much input that we got from municipalities. In this case, we're talking to district attorneys, we're talking to folks in law enforcement, we're talking to the defense bar and advocates to see what the right combination here is to address this bill. So the civil asset forfeiture bill deals with the criminal justice system when assets that were used or allegedly used in the commission of a crime are seized, and how those assets get disposed of and who gets the benefit of that disposition, whether it's the DAs, whether it's the state general fund. So that's going to be an interesting debate, and I would predict a fairly controversial one.
Can assets be cash also, or are they, cars?
They absolutely, all of the above.
Okay, all right.
All of the above. And so we can conduct civil asset forfeiture now, and it does happen. The question is, does the system that we currently use need reform? And so that's the subject of that bill. The other 2 bills have to do with the issues of juvenile diversion, and I'll give you an example. There is a $40 fee, a supervision fee, that youth are charged in the court system, and the goal is to try to eliminate that. So that's one less hurdle, one less obstacle that we have to deal with. But the idea is also to try to streamline the criminal justice system for youth. So there are tools in that bill that deal with things like video conferencing for arraignment and other, as opposed to having someone appear in court, other kinds of things of that nature. And then the third bill really deals more with diversion. And diversion is a very important concept in the criminal justice system, of saying to someone who's coming through the door of the system, they've been arrested, they've committed some sort of an offense, to look at that individual and to say, is the best place for this person, is the best path to travel really going into court and potentially being sanctioned that way? Or is a better path going into either treatment or some other youth program or something that doesn't have the same consequences, stigmatizing a young person with regard to creating a criminal record? And certainly not everyone is eligible for this, nor should they be. But if there's an individual that could benefit more from traveling that alternative path, should we be looking at that? Now, the issue with diversion right now is a lot of the district attorneys run these programs. In fact, our district attorney, John Blodgett, has a very successful diversion program. The issue is, should the courts now be taking on more of the responsibility for diversion as opposed to only the DAs? And so that's going to be the discussion that we have around that bill.
Could you just speak very quickly as to the difference between the courts doing it and the DAs doing it?
Well, that's an interesting thing that we're actually going to be talking about and trying to define. So right now, the DA has the exclusivity relative to the decision because the person is before them for charging and disposition. And so at a very early stage, the DA is making the decision. If the courts do it, then the person pretty much is going to already be somehow in the court system. And the question is, how is the best way for that to play out? And do all the courts want to do that? Do they all have the capability of doing it? And is it in the best interest of justice?
And talk about bail reform really quickly. That's in there too, right?
So the bail reform piece is really just about this supervision fee that gets charged right now, and it's a bail fee. And the exact term is escaping me, but the idea is there's an upfront fee that maybe we could dispense with and create a better situation. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I want you to get out there on this beautiful day and enjoy it. And I'm sure you have a ribbon cutting to go to.
Unfortunately, I don't have one today, but I do in fact have one tomorrow. So on Bearskin Neck, no less. So,
nice. Where on Bearskin Neck?
It is at the new studio that's been opened up, and I'm trying to think of the name of the studio, and it escapes me. But it's Lauren Doucette's studio, and it's pretty much an all-day event. I think it starts at 11 and it goes till 4. So I'd encourage people to stop by, but also remind them that the ribbon cutting itself is at 1 p.m. But something else that's happening this weekend that I don't think gets enough attention are the international Dory races, which will be happening in the Inner Harbor in Gloucester at 10 a.m. And this is the 70th year that these races have been taking place between people in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia and Gloucester. And so as we may have discussed in the past, the Canadians come here. They're in town now. We had a reception for them last night, and they race. And then in August, our folks go there. And so, and that hasn't been able to happen because of the pandemic and border crossing issues, but now it is. And it's a very exciting thing, and it's something I'm very enthusiastic about.
I love those races.
Well, we encourage everyone to come out and see, and it's an amazing tradition. It's an amazing competition. And whenever I talk to somebody who's any more than 5 miles from the coast, they say, "What's a Dory?"
Well, I look forward to seeing them out there and maybe see you on Bearskin Neck this weekend.
Well, I hope to see you at all of the above, and I also hope to see you next week when we can keep the conversation going.
I hope so. You just got to clear up your schedule a little bit better.
A few less ribbon cuttings, maybe, I don't know.
Please, put those scissors away for a while. All right, we'll see you. Thank you.
All right, take care, Heather. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Interested in a sponsorship? Email sponsor@1623studios.org to learn more.